July 26, 1944. Dawn. Saint-Gilles, Normandy. Oberleutnant Friedrich Lex stood in the commander's cupola of his Panzer IV, Aus FH, scanning the road that led north through the shattered village. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows like funeral shrouds, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rumble of engines. American engines. His tank was positioned behind a stone barn at the village crossroads hull down, nearly invisible. The long barrel of his 7.5-centimeter KIK Ta-Shashwarty gun extended forward like an accusing finger. Around him, the rest of 5. Compagnie Panzer Lehr Regiment 130 waited in similar positions. 15 tanks. Not many, but enough. Because they were German tanks. And the Americans had Shermans. Lex smiled, though there was no humor in it. The smile of a man who knows he holds superior cards. The Sherman tank, the Army's main battle tank, their pride and joy, was a joke. A death trap on tracks. Ronson lighters, the men called them. One shot, and they brewed up like a cigarette lighter. Every tanker knew the statistics, even if they didn't speak about them openly. The Sherman 75mm M3 gun had a muzzle velocity of barely 2050 feet per second. The German 7.5-centimeter KIK Ta-Shashwarty Kalbestrea. The math was simple, brutal, decisive. The Sherman's armor, 2.5 inches on the front glacis plate angled at 60 degrees. Adequate perhaps against the short-barreled guns of 1942. Useless against modern German tank guns. Lex Panzer IV could penetrate a Sherman from nearly 2,000 meters straight through the front. The Sherman would have to get within 600 meters and catch him on the flank to have any chance at all. And that was just the Panzer IV. The Americans faced far worse. Somewhere to his left, dug into the hedgerows around Hebecravon, 16 Panther tanks from a Hay Bataillon, Panzer Regiment 6, waited like hunting cats. The Panther, 53 tons of German engineering superiority, 3.5 inches of armor on the front glacis, sloped at 38 degrees. A long-barreled 7.5-centimeter first KT-22TE, C1, barreled 7.5-centimeter first KTE, Pate K2T, Shias, Lone Sats. Lonks had seen what happened when Shermans encountered Panthers. The American shells simply bounced off the Panther's frontal armor, sparking and ricocheting into the Norman sky like fireworks. Meanwhile, the Panther's gun could punch through a Sherman at ranges where the American tank couldn't even see its killer. 5-to-1 advantage at least. Some tankers said it was more like 8-to-1, and if the Americans were truly unlucky, they might encounter a King Tiger. 64 tons, 6 inches of armor at 45 degrees. An 88mm gun that could destroy a Sherman through a brick wall, or as had happened at least once through another Sherman tank first. The rumble of engines grew louder. Lex dropped into the turret and pulled the hatch closed above him, leaving it open just a crack. His gunner Feldwebel Dietrich was already at his position, eye pressed to the gunner's sight. The loader stood ready, a long brass-cased armor-piercing round in his hands. The radio operator and driver were motionless in the hull, waiting. "Contact," Dietrich said quietly. Sherman, 500 meters. Lex peered through the narrow vision slit. There, emerging from the morning mist like a gray ghost, was an M4 Sherman's more infantry. A half-track. Another Sherman. Another. Lex, confidence faltered just for a moment. How many were there? But it didn't matter. They were Shermans. Inferior machines crewed by soldiers who'd been training for less time than his own men had been fighting. This would be a turkey shoot. Range? 400 meters now, Herr Oberleutnant. Closing, Wait for my command." The Sherman continued forward unaware. Its commander stood in the cupola scanning with binoculars. The infantry riding on the back looked tense but not terrified. They didn't know. They couldn't see the German tanks hidden in the ruins, couldn't see the guns zeroing in on their thin armor. Lex felt something like pity. Then it passed. War was mathematics. Superior firepower plus heavier armor equaled survival. The Americans were about to learn that equation the hard way. "Target the lead tank," Lex ordered. "Panzer granite. Fire when ready." Dietrich's hand moved to the firing lever. His breathing steadied. Professional. Mechanical. The Sherman rolled closer. 300 meters now. Everything happened in an instant. But before we see how this encounter ends, we need to understand what the Americans were facing. Because the German tankers weren't wrong about their technical superiority. They were absolutely mathematically lethally correct. Lieutenant Belton Y. Cooper of the 3rd Armored Division's Maintenance Battalion stood in what the Army called a Vehicle Collection Point, the VCP, somewhere behind the American lines in Normandy. Around him, M4 Sherman tanks sat in various states of destruction. Some had neat round holes punched through their armor. Others were burned out hulks, their interiors scorched black. A few had been torn open by internal explosions, their turrets blown 10 feet away. Cooper was 27 years old. He was a maintenance officer, which meant his job was to coordinate the recovery, repair, and evacuation of damaged combat equipment. He traveled with the combat commands during the day, then drove back through enemy territory at night to deliver combat loss reports to the battalion headquarters, 30 to 60 miles to the rear. He had seen things that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. The maintenance crews were working on one of the Shermans now, a tank that had taken a German 7.5 centimeter armor-piercing round through the front. The projectile had penetrated the glacis plate, passed through the driver's compartment, and detonated somewhere inside the fighting compartment. When a tank received the full effect of a penetration, as Cooper would later write, the results were catastrophic. The armor-piercing projectile, traveling at thousands of feet per second, punched through the steel plate in a shower of molten metal fragments. These fragments, along with pieces of the projectile itself, ricocheted through the interior at lethal velocities. They severed arms, legs, heads. They ignited ammunition. They set fire to fuel lines and hydraulic fluid. Sometimes the blast was so intense that bodies literally exploded. Blood, brain matter, and gore were splattered across every surface inside the tank. The maintenance crews had to get inside and clean it all up, trying to keep body parts together in a shelter, have to turn over to graves registration. They used strong detergent, disinfectant, and water, scrubbing the interior as best they could, so men could get back inside and repair the tank. Often when a tank was penetrated, the electrical cables would be severed. This caused shorts that could set the tank on fire. And once a Sherman started burning, it usually didn't stop. The German tankers had a nickname for the M4 Sherman, the Ronsenleiter. Lights. First time every time. American tank crews had their own name for it, the Death Trap. Cooper walked around the tank, making notes on his clipboard. This one was a total loss. The entire turret basket was warped from the internal explosion. The ammunition racks had cooked off. The transmission was cracked. It would have to be evacuated to the ordnance company, assuming they could even spare the recovery vehicles to move it. He recorded the W number, the tank's serial number, and moved to the next vehicle. This was what haunted Cooper, what would haunt him for decades. The 3rd Armored Division had entered combat in Normandy with 232 M4 Sherman tanks. By the end of the European campaign, the division would have 648 Shermans completely destroyed in combat. Another 700 would be knocked out, repaired, and put back into operation. That was a loss rate of 580%. 580%. The mathematics were staggering. Every Sherman that rolled off the landing craft at Normandy would on average be completely destroyed nearly 3 times over. The only reason the division could continue fighting was because of the replacement system, the steady stream of new tanks flowing from the United States across the Atlantic through the ports and up to the front lines. But even that system couldn't replace the men inside the tanks. The tank commanders, gunners, loaders, drivers, and bow gunners who died when German shells punched through their inadequate armor. Cooper had been to the Armored Force Tank School at Fort Knox. Had taken copious notes, read every field manual, studied every G2 intelligence report on German tanks. Before Normandy, Head felt confident. The M4 Sherman, with its 75mm gun mounted in a fully rotating turret, was far superior to the old M3 Grant with its sponson-mounted gun. American tankers had used Shermans successfully in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. They'd been told the Sherman was a good tank, thoroughly capable of dealing with German armor on an equal basis. That belief had died in the hedgerows of Normandy. The Germans were fielding 3 main types of tanks now, and all 3 were superior to the Sherman. The PCKPFW-4, what Americans usually called the Mark IV, weighed 23 tons and had 4 inches of vertical armor on the front. Its long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm gun had a muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet per second. It could engage and destroy Shermans at ranges where the American tanks couldn't effectively fight back. Then came the Panther. PCKPFWV, 53 tons. 3.5 inches of armor on the front glacis plate sloped at 38 degrees, below the critical angle of ricochet. The Panther's gun had a muzzle velocity of 300 feet per second. There were many documented cases of Shermans scoring multiple direct hits on the front of a Panther, only to see the shells bounce off harmlessly. Meanwhile, the Panther could knock out a Sherman at 2,000 yards head-on. And finally, the King Tiger. PCKPFWV-6, OSF-B. 64 tons of nightmare. 6 inches of armor at 45 degrees on the glacis plate. A long-barreled 88mm gun with a muzzle velocity of 250 feet per second. The King Tiger could knock out Shermans at ranges exceeding 3,000 yards, nearly 2 miles. The German gun could penetrate the lighter armor of a Sherman after shooting through a brick wall. In at least one documented instance, it had knocked out a Sherman by shooting through another Sherman tank first. The qualitative superiority of German tanks over the M4 Sherman was, in Cooper's estimation, at least 5-1. Some observers put it higher. Before the Normandy invasion, some U.S. armored commanders had assumed that because the Sherman was lighter than the Panther, it would be more mobile. This assumption was dead wrong. The key to a tank's off-road mobility wasn't weight. It was ground-bearing pressure, how the weight was distributed over the tracks. Because the Panther had wider tracks than the Sherman, it actually had lower ground-bearing pressure. It could go places the Sherman couldn't. The Sherman's narrow tracks made it nearly useless in mud and snow. Standing in the VCP, watching maintenance crews drag another burned-out Sherman into position, Cooper couldn't help but ask himself the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Why? Why had American tank designers created such an inferior weapon? The United States was the greatest industrial nation on Earth. American engineers had produced superior weapons in vast quantities. The M1 Garand rifle, the .50 caliber machine gun, the 105mm howitzer, the P-51 Mustang fighter, the B-17 bomber. America enjoyed superiority in nearly every category of weapons. But not tanks. The M4 Sherman's inferiority wasn't predestined. It was the result of bureaucratic bickering, inter-service rivalry, and catastrophic miscalculation. The infantry wanted a heavy breakthrough tank. The armored officers wanted a fast mobile tank with adequate armor and a high-velocity gun. The artillery officers felt that tanks were essentially mobile artillery pieces, and therefore they should dictate the characteristics of the gun. Artillery won that argument. They insisted on a low-velocity gun that could fire at least 5,000 rounds before needing replacement. Apparently, it never occurred to anyone that there was only a remote possibility a tank would last long enough in combat to fire 5,000 rounds. Meanwhile, Ordnance intelligence had indicated that the Germans were rapidly replacing short-barreled guns with long-barreled high-velocity weapons. There was information that the Russians and Germans were using tanks against tanks in massive battles on the Eastern Front. This should have been the handwriting on the wall for future trends in high-velocity tank gun design. It was either misunderstood or completely ignored. Cooper made another notation on his clipboard. Another total loss. Another tank that would need to be replaced. He looked up at the sky. Somewhere out there beyond the hedgerows, American tank crews were climbing into their Shermans, starting their engines and rolling forward to meet German guns they couldn't match. And they knew it. Every man who climbed into a Sherman knew the odds. They knew the statistics even if they didn't speak about them openly. They knew that German tanks could kill them at ranges where they couldn't fight back. They knew that a single 7.5 centimeters or 88 millimeter projectile could turn their tank into a steel coffin in less than a second. And still they climbed in. Still they started the engines. Still they rolled forward. Because there was a war to win. And because, even if individual German tanks were superior, there was something the Germans couldn't match. There were so many more American tanks. July 24, 1944, 1944. 1300 hours. Somewhere over Normandy. The sky turned black. Not with storm clouds but with aircraft. 1,500 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flying in tight formations, their bellies heavy with bombs. Behind them 380 B-26 Marauders. Ahead of them fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, prowling like wolves. The target, a 7,000-yard-long sector of German defensive positions along the Paris-Saint-Lô highway. A narrow strip of Norman farmland where the German Panzer Division had dug in to stop the American advance. Operation Cobra. The largest aerial bombardment in support of ground troops ever attempted. On the ground below, German soldiers looked up and felt their blood turn to ice. Generalmajor Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Division, was in his command post when the bombs started falling. The first sensation wasn't sound. It was pressure. The air itself seemed to compress, then expand, then compress again in rapid succession as hundreds of bombs detonated across his divisional sector. The concussion was so powerful, it knocked loose equipment off tables. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling. The field telephone lines went dead instantly. Then came the sound. A continuous rolling thunder that went on and on and on like the end of the world. Bayerlein had fought in North Africa, Poland, France, and Russia. Had survived British artillery barrages at El Alamein and Soviet Katyusha rocket attacks at Kursk. Had never experienced anything like this. 4,700 tons of bombs fell in approximately 1 hour. The American heavy bombers dropped their loads from altitude, 3,000, 6,000, 10,000 feet, attempting to saturate the target area. Some bombs fell precisely on target. Others fell short, killing American troops in the forward positions. Still others fell long, cratering empty fields beyond the German lines. But enough bombs fell on the Panzer Division to devastate it. When the bombing finally stopped, Bayerlein emerged from his bunker to survey the damage. What he saw defied description. Entire platoon positions had simply ceased to exist, obliterated by direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs. Craters 20 feet deep and 40 feet across pockmarked the landscape. Trees were shredded into matchsticks. Stone buildings were reduced to rubble. The carefully prepared defensive positions, the machine gun nests, the mortar pits, the artillery emplacements, had been blown apart. And the men. Of the 3,600 troops under Bearline's immediate control, approximately 1,000 were dead or wounded. Another 1,000 were so severely concussed and disoriented that they could barely function. Many were bleeding from their ears and noses, their eardrums ruptured by the overpressure. Some were simply catatonic, staring into space, unable to respond to orders. The communications network, which depended heavily on field telephone lines, was completely destroyed. Bearline had no way to contact his subordinate units, no way to coordinate a defense, no way to call for reinforcements or artillery support. But Bearline was a veteran, a professional. Head survived worse situations, barely, and had learned that the first rule after a catastrophic bombardment was to take stock of what remained. His armored strength was partially intact. The bombing had been erratic in its coverage. The center of the bomb zone where the heavy bombers had concentrated their attack was devastated. But positions closer to the American lines had been relatively untouched. Some of his tanks had survived. Around Hebe-Cravon, 16 Panther tanks from E Bataillon Panzer Regiment 6 were still operational. These Panthers had been rotated to the front line just the previous night, replacing the Panzer of Les Rolls of Reveringswell. Because these Panthers had been rotated to the front line just the previous night, replacing the Pat Serval, Bear-U, Bassinet, E.T., Well, Chie. Roaching from Jor, Warage Orpedic Size. Portier, Jerth, Maca, E.T., Bazira, Ya, E.T., Bazira, Local, and Place. Maca U, Bass, Place, Berry. The Americans' paper defensive positions could exact a terrible toll. The question was whether they could hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive. "We will hold," Bearline told his officers. "Every position, every hedgerow, every village. Make the Amis pay in blood for every meter. They would hold. They would make the Americans pay." What Bearline didn't know, couldn't know, was the scale of what was coming. Because Operation Cobra wasn't just an attack. It was a tidal wave. Behind the American lines, Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division was preparing to move. CCA was one of 3 semi-independent battle groups within the division. It was built around the 66th Armored Regiment, 3 battalions of M4 Sherman medium tanks, reinforced by a regimental combat team from the 4th Infantry Division, self-propelled artillery, tank destroyers, combat engineers, and all the supporting arms necessary for sustained combat operations. The commander was Brigadier General Maurice Rose. He was 45 years old, a veteran of World War I, and one of the most aggressive armored commanders in the U.S. Army. Rose had a simple tactical philosophy: attack, attack, attack. Never give the enemy time to recover. Never let him consolidate his defenses. Keep moving forward, always forward until the enemy broke. Under Rose's command, CCA fielded approximately 70 M4 Sherman medium tanks plus M5A1 light tanks, M10 and M36 tank destroyers, M7 105mm self-propelled howitzers, and a company of armored infantry in M2 and M3 half-tracks. In the assembly areas behind the front lines, tank crews performed final checks on their vehicles. Ammunition was loaded. 71 rounds of 75mm for the Sherman's main gun, plus thousands of rounds for the bow-mounted and turret-mounted 30-caliber machine guns, and the 50-caliber anti-aircraft gun. Fuel tanks were topped off. Track tension was checked. Radios were tested. Many of the Shermans now sported an unusual modification. On their bows, crude steel frames welded to the front, looking like metal teeth or tusks. These were Coulin hedgerow cutters, named after Sergeant Curtis G. Coulin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Coulon had devised a simple solution to one of Normandy's most vexing tactical problems: the hedgerows. Norman hedgerows, bocage, were earth and foliage barriers that French farmers had built up over centuries. They were typically 4 to 6 feet high, composed of thick earth embankments, topped with dense vegetation. Tanks trying to climb over them would expose their thin belly armor to German anti-tank weapons. The Coulon cutter allowed tanks to punch through the hedgerows instead of climbing over them. The steel for the cutters came from German beach obstacles, the steel beams and rails that had been placed on the Normandy beaches to stop Allied landing craft. American ingenuity turning German defenses into offensive weapons. Sergeant Curtis G. Coulon's invention would prove crucial in the coming battle. But the Coulon cutters weren't the Americans' secret weapon. Their real advantage was something the Germans couldn't match, couldn't counter, and were only beginning to fully comprehend. Numbers. By late July 1944, the 1st U.S. Army had deployed 4 armored divisions and 13 separate tank battalions in Normandy. Combined strength 1,555 tanks. About 1/3 were M5A1 light tanks, useful for reconnaissance, but nearly useless in combat against German armor. But the remainder were M4 Shermans, and there were more than 1,000 of them. Supporting these tanks were 880 tank destroyers, M10s with 3-inch guns, M18 Hellcats with 76mm guns, and the new M36 with a powerful 90mm gun that could finally challenge German heavy armor on equal terms. Add in self-propelled artillery armored cars and other armored fighting vehicles, and the Americans were fielding more than 3,000 armored vehicles in Normandy. Against this armada, the Germans could muster fewer than 300 tanks and assault guns along the entire Normandy front. In the specific sector targeted by Operation Cobra, a frontage less than 30 kilometers wide, German armored strength was perhaps 100 tanks. To put this in perspective, Operation Cobra involved more armored fighting vehicles than the legendary tank battle of Prokhorovka during the Kursk campaign. At Prokhorovka, on July 12, 1943, approximately 420 German tanks and assault guns faced 840 Soviet tanks on a 50-kilometer front. That battle was considered one of the largest tank engagements in history. Operation Cobra was bigger. The American advantage wasn't just in numbers of tanks on the battlefield. It was in the entire industrial and logistical system that supported those tanks. Lieutenant Belton Cooper's job encapsulated this advantage perfectly. When Sherman tanks were knocked out in combat, Cooper would travel to the battlefield, assess the damage, and assign W numbers to the total losses. He would compile a combat loss report, and then, usually at night, drive back through enemy territory to deliver the report to the Ordnance Battalion headquarters, 30 to 60 miles to the rear. Within 48 hours, replacement tanks would arrive at the front. 48 hours. The Americans could lose 50 tanks in a day and have them all replaced within 2 days. Combat units maintained near constant strength despite horrific losses. The 2nd Armored Division would enter Operation Cobra with 394 tanks. Throughout the week-long battle, it would maintain an operational strength of 385 to 415 tanks, even while suffering dozens of combat losses. The Germans had no equivalent system. When a German tank was knocked out, it was typically abandoned on the battlefield. There were no spare parts, no replacement vehicles, no industrial base pumping out hundreds of new tanks every month. German armored units were slowly bleeding to death. The statistics told the story. On June 10, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, the Panzer Lehr Division had 98 Fisky 5-14 tanks and 88 Panthers. By July 1, that had decreased to 36 Fisky 5-14 and 32 Panthers. By July 23, on the eve of Operation Cobra, 15 Pedalski 5-14 and 16 Panthers. By August 1, after Operation Cobra 5-14 and 12 Panthers, the Panzer Lehr Division was being bled white, and there were no reinforcements coming. Lieutenant Colonel Lindsay C. Harkness, Jr. commanded 2nd Battalion, 66th Armored Regiment. He was 29 years old, a West Point graduate, and a veteran of the North African and Sicilian campaigns. His battalion would form one of the two main task forces of Combat Command A during Operation Cobra. On the evening of July 25, Harkness gathered his officers for final orders. The plan was straightforward. The 2nd Battalion would advance south from the line of departure break, through whatever remained of the German defenses, after the aerial bombardment, and drive toward the town of Cannacy. The 3rd Battalion would advance on a parallel route to the east. Speed and aggression were paramount. Don't stop to reduce every German strongpoint. Bypass when possible. Keep moving. The officers studied their maps. Cannacy was approximately 7 kilometers from the start line. Under normal circumstances, a mechanized column could cover that distance in less than an hour. But these weren't normal circumstances. German tanks, anti-tank guns, and infantry would contest every kilometer. The bocage terrain limited visibility and mobility. And they would be advancing through an area that had just been carpet-bombed. Roads would be cratered, bridges potentially destroyed. How long to reach Cannacy? One officer asked. Harkness considered. Nightfall. We should reach Cannacy by nightfall. It was an optimistic estimate. But optimism was part of the American tactical doctrine. Aggressive forward movement. Don't give the enemy time to recover. Hit him hard and keep hitting him until he breaks. One more thing, Harkness said. We've been assigned infantry support. Company from the 22nd Regiment will ride on the tanks. Keep them mounted as long as possible. They're exposed up there, but we need their firepower immediately available if we run into opposition. The officers nodded. Riding into combat on the back of a tank was terrifying for infantrymen. They were completely exposed, vulnerable to machine gun fire, artillery fragments, and every other danger of the battlefield. But the alternative, having infantry dismount and clear every hedgerow on foot, would slow the advance to a crawl. Speed was survival. Questions. There were none. Or rather, there were hundreds of questions, but none that could be answered until they actually made contact with the enemy. What strength would the Germans be able to muster after the bombing? How many tanks remained operational? Would they fight or retreat? The only way to find out was to attack. Get some rest, Harkness told his officers. We move at first light. July 26, 1944, 0600 hours. The American columns began rolling south. Combat Command A advanced with 2nd Battalion on the west side of the Saint-Gilles-Cannazy Road and 3rd Battalion on the east side. Each battalion task force consisted of a company of Shermans in the lead, followed by more tanks, then tank destroyers, then self-propelled artillery, then supply trucks, then more tanks bringing up the rear. Infantry from the 22nd Regiment rode on the tanks, a dozen men perched precariously on each Sherman's engine deck, hanging onto whatever handholds they could find. Their rifles were slung across their backs, or cradled in their laps. Some looked excited. Most looked terrified. The columns moved slowly at first, navigating around bomb craters and debris. The landscape was surreal. Entire forests reduced to splintered stumps, farmhouses, flattened roads torn apart. In the center of the bomb zone, where the heavy bombers had concentrated their attack, almost nothing remained standing. But as the American columns moved south, leaving the devastated zone behind, the terrain gradually returned to something approaching normal. Hedgerows, small fields, stone farmhouses, and, potentially, German defenders. In the lead Sherman of E Company 66th Armored Regiment, the tank commander scanned ahead with binoculars. The village of Saint-Gilles was just ahead, maybe 500 meters. Smoke rose from several buildings, probably hit during the bombing. But the village didn't look completely destroyed. Were there Germans in Saint-Gilles? Probably. Would they fight? Only one way to find out. The Sherman advanced. Behind it, the rest of the column followed. Tank after tank after tank. A steel river flowing south, unstoppable. From his position in the ruins of Saint-Gilles, Oberleutnant Friedrich Lex watched them come. The first Sherman to enter Saint-Gilles died instantly. It rolled around the corner of a stone building, advancing at perhaps 10 miles per hour, its commander standing in the open cupola scanning for threats. The infantry riding on its back looked nervous, fingers on triggers, eyes darting to every window and doorway. The Panzer IV that killed it was hull down behind a rubble pile, only its turret visible at a range of perhaps 200 meters. One shot. The 7.5-centimeter armor-piercing projectile struck the Sherman just below the turret, penetrating the hull side at a near-perfect angle. The tungsten cord penetrator punched through the armor and detonated inside the fighting compartment. The Sherman shuddered, lurched to a stop, and sat silent for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it exploded. The turret didn't blow off. That was actually rarer than Hollywood suggested. But flames erupted from every opening: the hatches, the pistol port, the bow machine gun mount. The infantry riding on the back had perhaps 2 seconds to react. Most managed to throw themselves clear. 3 weren't fast enough. They were engulfed in flames, screaming, rolling on the ground, trying to extinguish themselves. The Sherman burned with shocking intensity. Diesel fuel doesn't normally burn like gasoline. But when a 75mm ammunition rack cooks off inside a tank, it creates temperatures high enough to ignite anything. The rubber road wheels began to burn. The paint blistered and peeled. Within 60 seconds, the entire vehicle was a roaring inferno. And then the second Sherman rounded the corner. This tank commander had seen his comrade die. He knew there was a German tank somewhere ahead, concealed in the ruins. But he couldn't see it. The stone buildings, the rubble piles, the hedgerows. They created a maze of blind spots and kill zones. The Sherman advanced cautiously, its turret traversing left and right, the gunner searching desperately for a target. 25 meters behind this Sherman, Lieutenant George Wilson of the 22nd Infantry Regiment lay prone in a brick gutter, his M1 Garand rifle clutched to his chest. Wilson was 22 years old. This was his first major combat action, and he was absolutely terrified. From his position, he had a perfect view of the street, and that's when he saw it, a German Panzer IV medium tank cutting around the corner only a short block away, heading directly toward him. The Sherman and the Panzer IV saw each other at the same instant. Both tanks fired. The range was less than 100 yards. Point blank for tank combat. Both missed. The Sherman was backing up desperately, its driver throwing the transmission into reverse, the engine howling. The Panzer IV advanced its long gun, tracking the gunner, trying to get another shot lined up. They fired again, simultaneously. Missed again. The concussion from the muzzle blasts shattered windows in the buildings lining the street. Each explosion knocked Lieutenant Wilson's helmet halfway off his head. The narrow, walled-in street acted like a sound tunnel, amplifying every blast. Wilson pressed himself as flat as possible into the gutter, certain he was about to die. The tanks fired again, and again, and again. How were they both missing at this range? There were multiple factors. Both tanks were moving. The Sherman backwards, the Panzer IV forwards, which made accurate fire difficult. The street was filled with dust and smoke from the first kill, obscuring visibility. The gunners on both sides were pumping adrenaline, hands shaking slightly, trying to aim while their tanks rocked and swayed. And there was another factor: at these close ranges, even inferior armor could sometimes cause ricochets. The Sherman's armor wasn't great, but it was sloped, and a shot that hit at the wrong angle might deflect. Similarly, the Panzer IV's side armor, much thinner than its frontal armor, was somewhat vulnerable, but a rushed shot might glance off instead of penetrating. The sixth or seventh shot, Wilson lost count, finally connected. The Panzer IV suddenly went up in flames. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. The Sherman's armor-piercing round had penetrated somewhere critical, possibly the ammunition stowage, possibly a fuel line. The result was catastrophic. 2 German crewmen tried to escape through the cupola hatch. They were immediately cut down by machine gun fire from the Sherman, the 30 caliber coaxial gun firing in short controlled bursts. Their bodies tumbled from the turret and lay still in the street. The Panzer commander emerged last. Blood flowed from his ears and nose, the telltale signs of severe concussion from the penetration. He was in a daze, stumbling forward toward Wilson's position, seemingly unaware of where he was or what had happened. Wilson raised his M1 Garand and fired from his prone position. 3 shots. The first hit the German officer in the leg. The second and third missed as the man spun and fell. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Wilson lay in the gutter, breathing hard, his ears ringing so badly he couldn't hear anything. Around him, American infantry were emerging from cover, moving forward cautiously, rifles at the ready. The Sherman that had killed the Panzer IV rumbled past its commander, giving Wilson a quick salute from the cupola. Further down the street, another explosion. A second Panzer IV knocked out, this one by a Sherman from a different platoon that had worked its way around the flank. The battle for Saint-Gilles was essentially over. 2 German tanks destroyed. The surviving panzers from 5 Compagnie were withdrawing south toward the next defensive line. They'd inflicted casualties. 1 Sherman destroyed, several infantrymen killed, but they hadn't stopped the American advance. They'd only delayed it. This engagement, 2 German tanks versus a company of American Shermans, encapsulated something that German tankers were beginning to understand with growing horror. Yes, German tanks were technically superior. Yes, the German 7.5 centimeter gun had better armor penetration than the American 75 millimeter. Yes, German armor was generally thicker and better sloped. But none of that mattered when you were outnumbered 5-1, or 10-1, or, in some sectors, 20-1. The mathematics of tank combat weren't as simple as muzzle velocity and armor thickness. There were other factors. Critical factors. After the war, Britain's Army Operational Research Group would conduct detailed studies of tank versus tank combat effectiveness. They defined effectiveness as the reciprocal of the number of tanks required per enemy tank to achieve parity in battle. In other words, if you need 5 of your tanks to equal 3 enemy tanks, your effectiveness ratio is 0.6. The studies concluded that at 1,000 yards range, the PSCT-P4Y4 BOS-FACE was about 10% more effective than the standard 75 mm Sherman. Not 5 times more effective, not twice as effective. 10%. At 1,500 yards, the Sherman was actually slightly more effective than the Panzer IV. How could this be? How could German tankers' conviction of overwhelming superiority be so at odds with the statistical reality? The answer lay in the circumstances of engagement. Tank combat wasn't a sterile test range exercise where both sides lined up at known ranges and fired at stationary targets. Tank combat was chaos. It was confusion, smoke dust, hedgerows, villages, forests, hills, and 1,000 factors that had nothing to do with gun specifications. And the most important factor of all, who saw whom first. Operational research from both World War II and the Korean War demonstrated that the side which spotted the enemy and engaged first had up to a 6-fold advantage. 6 times. The simplest rule of tank fighting was see first, engage first, hit first. This negated much of the German tank's technical advantage. A Panther that couldn't see a Sherman hidden in a hedgerow was just a very expensive target. A Tiger that took a 75mm round to its thin side armor before it could react was just as dead as a Sherman hit from the front. And there was another critical factor: crew quality and training. German propaganda emphasized the superiority of German soldiers, but the reality in mid-1944 was more complex. Many veteran German tank crews had been killed in Russia, North Africa, or earlier campaigns in France. Replacement crews often had limited training. Fuel shortages meant fewer training hours. Some German tankers in Normandy had less than 20 hours of actual driving time before being committed to combat. American tank crews, by contrast, typically received months of training. They had extensive practice in gunnery, driving, radio procedures, and crew coordination. They'd had access to unlimited fuel for training exercises. The quality difference wasn't overwhelming, but it was significant. And then there was the American combined arms doctrine. German tanks in Normandy were often expected to fight alone, or with minimal infantry support. American tanks never fought alone. Every Sherman advance was coordinated with infantry, artillery, air support, and tank destroyers. If a Sherman encountered a Panther, it couldn't kill. The tank commander would call in artillery or air support, or head maneuver to expose the Panther to an M36 tank destroyer with a 90mm gun that could penetrate its armor, or head use smoke rounds to blind the Panther, while other Shermans maneuvered to attack its flanks. Lieutenant George Wilson, still lying in that gutter in Saint-Gilles, understood none of this. He just knew that German tanks were terrifying, American tanks were brave, and somehow, through courage and luck, and sheer weight of numbers, the Americans were winning. The advance continued throughout the day. On July 26, Combat Command. A 2nd Armored Division pushed south through the shattered German defenses. They encountered small German formations at every kilometer. A few tanks here, an infantry company there, an anti-tank gun position blocking a road. Each strongpoint delayed the advance, inflicted casualties, and was then bypassed or destroyed. The American doctrine was simple: keep moving. Don't stop to reduce every position. If you encounter a strongpoint you can't quickly overcome, fix it in place with part of your force, and bypass it with the rest. Let the follow-on infantry deal with isolated German positions. The tank's job was to break through and keep going. By mid-afternoon, the 2nd Battalion, 66th Armored Regiment had advanced nearly 5 kilometers. They'd lost several tanks to German fire. Exact numbers were hard to determine in the chaos of combat. But the column kept moving. Every time a Sherman was knocked out, the tank behind it would push forward to take its place. Around 1800 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Herkness's command tank was knocked out south of the village of Cannacy. A German anti-tank gun, possibly a 7.5 cm Pak 40, fired from a concealed position and punched a round through the Sherman's side armor. The tank didn't burn, but it was immobilized, the tracks blown off. Herkness and his crew bailed out. Within minutes, Herkness had commandeered another Sherman from D Company. He transferred his maps and radio to the new vehicle and continued south with his column. This was the American system in action. One tank knocked out another, immediately took its place. One commander's vehicle destroyed, he simply took over a different tank. The advance never stopped. Around 2000 hours, the column encountered 2 more German tanks on the road, later identified as possibly belonging to 7. Compagnie Panzer Lehr Regiment 130. Both were burning. They might have been knocked out by American fire, or they might have been abandoned by their crews after mechanical breakdowns. The distinction hardly mattered. Either way, they were blocking the road. American tank retrievers attached tow cables and dragged the burning wrecks off the road so the column could pass. Harkness dismounted to supervise this operation. While approaching a nearby sunken road in the darkness, he became involved in a close-range pistol duel with 2 German officers. Harkness was wounded but managed to fell one of the Germans. The other fled. Years later, the memoirs of Lieutenant Freiherr von Landsberg-Valen, commander of 7 Kompanie, Panzer Lehr Regiment 130, would also mention a pistol duel with an American officer in that same area, around the same time. The 2 accounts might describe the same encounter. Enemies meeting by chance in the darkness, trading shots at point-blank range, both surviving to write about it decades later. Harkness refused evacuation. He remained in command of the 2nd Battalion throughout the night and for the remainder of Operation Cobra. For his actions on July 26, he would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His battalion, 2nd Battalion 66th Armored Regiment, would receive a Distinguished Unit Citation for its actions from July 26 to August 12, 1944. By midnight on July 26, Combat Command A had advanced approximately 7 kilometers and secured the town of Cannacy. The cost 49 tanks damaged or destroyed during the entire Operation Cobra. Personnel casualties for CCA. During the same period, 70 killed, 363 wounded, 36 missing. German casualties were catastrophic. The Panzer Lehr division had been shattered. By the end of July 26, the division's 3 panzer companies were reduced to a handful of operational tanks. Infantry companies were at 10 to 20% strength. Communications were disrupted. Supply lines were severed. The division continued to exist on paper, but as a combat-effective formation, it had ceased to function, and the Americans were just getting started. July 27, 1944. Somewhere in the bocage south of Cannacy, the American column, a company of M4 Sherman tanks followed by a company of armored infantry and half-tracks, rolled down a narrow country road. It was late afternoon. The column was stretched out over nearly a kilometer, tanks and vehicles spaced 50 meters apart to minimize casualties from artillery fire. Ahead, the road ran through a gentle valley between 2 wooded hills. Perfect terrain for an ambush. And that's exactly what it was. 7 King Tiger tanks appeared along the crest of the forward slope on the left side of the road. Not Panzer IVs, not even Panthers. King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world. 64 tons each. 6 inches of frontal armor. 88mm guns that could destroy a Sherman at 3,000 yards. The Tigers turned right into column formation and opened fire. The lead American Sherman exploded. The second Sherman exploded. The third Sherman managed to fire 1 shot, which bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's frontal armor, before it too was destroyed. At the same moment, 3 more King Tigers emerged from wooded hills on the right side of the road. The American column was caught in a perfect crossfire. No room to maneuver. No cover. No escape. Infantrymen leaped from their half-tracks and dove into ditches on both sides of the road. Some didn't make it. Machine gun fire from the Tigers' hull-mounted and turret-mounted MG-34s swept the road, cutting men down as they ran. The Sherman tanks tried to fight back, but the mathematics were impossible. The King Tiger's armor was essentially invulnerable to the Sherman's 75mm gun from the front. American gunners fired shot after shot, watching their armor-piercing rounds spark and ricochet off the Tiger's thick armor. Meanwhile, the Tiger's 88mm guns were punching through Shermans like paper. This was the nightmare scenario. This was what every American tanker feared. Caught in the open by superior German tanks at close range without the ability to maneuver or seek cover. And then one American tank crew did something unexpected. The Sherman was in the middle of the column, equipped with the short-barreled M2 75mm gun. even less powerful than the standard M375mm. It was commanded by a veteran sergeant who'd been fighting since North Africa. Had seen what happened when you tried to fight King Tigers with conventional tactics. So he tried something different. "Load white phosphorus," he ordered his loader. The loader hesitated for only a second. White phosphorus rounds were normally used for marking targets or creating smoke screens, not for fighting tanks. But he grabbed a Willie Pete round and slammed it into the breech. The gunner had a King Tiger in his sights. Range maybe 150 yards. The Tiger was advancing its long 88mm gun, traversing toward their position. Fire! The white phosphorus round struck the King Tiger's glacis plate right above the driver's compartment. There was no penetration. The round couldn't possibly penetrate 6 inches of armor at 45 degrees. But the effect was spectacular. The shell exploded on impact, showering the front of the Tiger with burning particles of white phosphorus. White phosphorus burns at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It sticks to metal, concrete, flesh, anything it touches, and it produces thick, choking white smoke. The entire faceplate in front of the Tiger's turret was suddenly covered with burning particles. Smoke engulfed the tank. Inside the Tiger, chaos erupted. The shock of the impact, even without penetration, must have been terrific. The noise alone was probably deafening, but worse was the smoke. King Tigers, like all German tanks, had a powerful ventilation fan in the engine compartment. This fan was designed to pull air through the fighting compartment to cool the crew and remove gun fumes. But now it was pulling in white phosphorus smoke. The smoke was noxious, choking, potentially deadly. And from inside the tank, with smoke obscuring all vision blocks, the crew couldn't see what was happening. They couldn't see that their tank wasn't actually on fire. It just looked like it was burning. After perhaps 30 seconds, the Tiger's hatches burst open, and the crew bailed out. The Sherman immediately traversed its gun to the second King Tiger in the column and fired another white phosphorus round. Same result. The Tiger was engulfed in flames and smoke. Its crew abandoned it. The Sherman's innovation worked for exactly 2 shots. Then a third King Tiger, farther back in the column, put an 88mm round through the Sherman's turret. The American tank exploded. But those 2 Tiger tanks had been neutralized. 2 64-ton monsters, the most powerful tanks in the world, abandoned by their crews because of smoke rounds from an inferior Sherman tank. By mid-June 1944, the use of white phosphorus in tank fighting had been disseminated widely throughout U.S. tank units in Normandy. It became standard operating procedure in many units. The tactic worked especially well against Panthers and Tigers. After encounters with these heavy German tanks in the first weeks of the campaign, American tank crews had learned that frontal attacks using armor-piercing ammunition were suicidal. The Sherman's 75mm gun simply couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at typical combat ranges. But a white phosphorus round fired against a Panther's front would blind the German tank and make it possible for Sherman units to maneuver to attack its weaker side armor. The secondary effect, forcing German crews to abandon their tanks, was a bonus. White phosphorus was particularly effective against inexperienced German crews. Veterans might recognize that the smoke and flames on the outside of their tank didn't necessarily mean the tank was actually burning internally. But replacement crews, many of whom had limited training and no combat experience, would panic and bail out. American tank commanders exploited this ruthlessly. The innovation spread through informal channels, tank commanders talking to each other, lessons passed down from veterans to replacements, after action reports that got circulated at battalion and regimental levels. Within weeks, use Willie Pete against Panthers and Tigers was common knowledge in American armored units. It wasn't a perfect solution. White phosphorus rounds couldn't actually destroy German heavy tanks. But they could neutralize them, at least temporarily. And in the chaos of combat, temporary advantage was often enough. More importantly, the white phosphorus tactic represented something larger: American adaptability. When American tank crews encountered a problem they couldn't solve through firepower, namely German tanks they couldn't penetrate, they found a different solution. Blind them, confuse them, force them to withdraw or abandon their vehicles. The Germans had technical superiority. The Americans had ingenuity. But sometimes, no amount of ingenuity could save you. July 27th, the 28th, 1944. Night. Near Saint-Denis-le-Gast. The German counterattacks began after dark. SS Panzer Grenadier Division Das Reich, one of the elite Waffen-SS divisions, had been ordered to plug the gap torn in the German lines by the American breakthrough. Das Reich was under strength, its units scattered, its communications disrupted, but it still represented a significant threat. The division had veteran troops, experienced officers, and, most importantly, tanks. Around 2200 hours, the 1st German column approached American positions near the crossroads of routes D. 2067th Armored Regiment and infantry from the 1st Battalion 41st Armored Infantry Regiment. They'd set up a hasty defense around the crossroads. Tanks in hull-down positions, infantry dug in a few bazookas distributed among the riflemen. The German flare gun fired, and suddenly, the night was bright as day. The Americans opened fire. Tanks, machine guns, bazookas, rifles. Everything they had. The German self-propelled gun, probably a 15-centimeter Hummel, took multiple hits and exploded. A Panther tank behind it was hit by bazooka fire and began to burn. But more Germans kept coming. Panther tanks overran the 3rd Battalion 67th Armored Regiment command post. American light tanks, M5A1s from the 2nd Platoon A Company 67th Armored, engaged at point-blank range. These were ridiculous odds. The M5A1 light tank weighed 18 tons, had an inch and a half of armor, and mounted a 37mm gun that was obsolete even by 1942 standards. Against a Panther, it was suicide. The light tanks fired anyway. Most of their shots bounced off. One Panther was damaged, possibly by a lucky shot to the tracks or drive sprocket. It withdrew. Another Panther continued forward, machine guns blazing, crushing an American half-track under its treads. American infantry swarmed the Panther. Men ran alongside it with satchel charges and grenades, trying to get close enough to damage the tracks or throw explosives into the engine deck. The Panther's machine guns cut them down. But more Americans kept coming. Finally, someone got close enough. A satchel charge detonated against the Panther's rear deck. The explosion didn't penetrate the armor, but it damaged the engine. The Panther ground to a halt, immobilized. Its crew bailed out and were captured. The first German attack had been repulsed, but barely. American casualties were mounting, and the Germans were just getting started. Around 0100 hours on July 28, a much larger German force appeared. This wasn't a company-sized probe. This was a major counterattack, over 2,000 troops, approximately 90 vehicles, including tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and self-propelled guns. The Germans' objective was to break through the American positions and recapture Gramesnil and Saint-Denis-le-Gast, hopefully severing the American supply lines. The American outpost that detected this column consisted of perhaps 20 tanks from E Company 67th Armored Regiment and 120 riflemen from the 1st Battalion 41st Armored Infantry. They'd established a perimeter defense around the road junction, with tanks in hull-down positions and infantry dug in around them. Sergeant Hulan Whittington, positioned in a forward observation post, spotted the German column first. It was approaching from the north, descending a hill toward the American positions. The Germans were using a clever tactic. They'd turned off their engines and were coasting downhill, trying to approach silently. Whittington immediately alerted his command. The Americans had perhaps 5 minutes to prepare. Tank commanders issued rapid orders. Gunners loaded armor-piercing rounds. Machine gunners checked their ammunition belts. Artillery forward observers began calling fire missions to the 62nd and 78th Armored Field Artillery Battalions, positioned to the rear. The German column continued down the hill, vehicles coasting in darkness. They probably thought they'd achieved surprise. They were wrong. At approximately 300 yards, the lead American Sherman opened fire. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire American position was firing. Tanks, machine guns, mortars, everything. The lead German vehicles exploded. The column bunched up as vehicles behind tried to stop or maneuver around the burning wrecks. This made them perfect targets. And then the artillery arrived. The 62nd and 78th Armored Field Artillery Battalions were equipped with M7 105mm howitzer motor carriages, self-propelled artillery built on modified Sherman chassis. They could fire at a rate of 4 rounds per minute. With multiple batteries firing simultaneously, they could deliver devastating concentrations of high-explosive shells. The artillery fire missions continued throughout the night. Every time the German column tried to maneuver or reorganize, American forward observers would call in new fire missions. High-explosive shells rained down on the German positions, turning the road into a killing ground. The 81mm mortar platoon attached to the 41st Armored Infantry added their own contribution: white phosphorus rounds. The WP rounds served dual purposes. First, they illuminated the battlefield, making it easier for American gunners to see their targets. Second, the white phosphorus itself caused casualties, burning through flesh and equipment, creating panic among German troops. The German column kept coming, wave after wave of vehicles and infantry, trying to force their way through the American positions. Panther tanks emerged from the chaos, their 7.5cm guns firing at American positions. Several Shermans were knocked out. American infantry casualties mounted. But the Americans held. As dawn broke on July 28, the battlefield was littered with destroyed German vehicles. Half-tracks burned. Trucks lay shattered. At least one Das Reich self-propelled artillery battalion had been destroyed. Over 300 German prisoners were taken. An estimated 1,000 German troops were killed. American casualties were significant, but manageable. E Company 67th Armored Regiment had lost several tanks. The 41st Armored Infantry had taken dozens of casualties. But the line held. The German counterattack failed. Sergeant Hulan Whittington, the man who'd first spotted the German column and alerted the American defenses, would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. The failed German counterattack near Saint-Denis-le-Gast illustrated another critical advantage the Americans possessed: logistics. When the American artillery batteries fired those continuous fire missions throughout the night of July 27 to 28, they expended thousands of rounds of 105mm ammunition. In a German army, such expenditure would have been catastrophic. Ammunition was always in short supply, and artillery units were expected to carefully ration their shells. But American ammunition supply was essentially unlimited. The artillery battalions fired as much as they needed, confident that resupply trucks would arrive within hours with fresh ammunition. The same was true for every category of supply: fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies, even complete replacement vehicles. Lieutenant Belton Cooper's job encapsulated this system. After every engagement, he would travel to the battlefield to assess damage. Tanks that could be repaired were dragged to the vehicle collection point. Maintenance crews, former farm equipment mechanics and industrial workers in civilian life, would work around the clock to repair damaged vehicles. Tanks with blown tracks would have new tracks installed. Tanks with damaged transmissions would have transmissions replaced. Tanks with electrical damage from near-miss artillery would be rewired. The maintenance crews could perform remarkably complex repairs in field conditions. Tanks that were damaged beyond field repair would be loaded onto tank transporters and sent back to ordnance companies farther to the rear. Many of these could still be salvaged. New turrets installed, new hulls mated to old turrets, engines replaced. Only tanks that were completely destroyed, burnt out, blown apart, or so heavily damaged that repair was impossible, would be written off as total losses. Cooper would record the W numbers of these total losses, compile his combat loss report, and deliver it to the Ordnance Battalion headquarters. Within 48 hours, replacement tanks would arrive at the front line. The German system, by contrast, was essentially non-existent. When a German tank was knocked out, it was usually abandoned on the battlefield. There was no organized recovery system, no mobile maintenance battalions, no steady stream of replacement vehicles. German tank units were slowly bleeding to death through attrition. The statistics told a grim story. In June 1944, after the initial D-Day landings, the Wehrmacht in the West received 456 replacement tanks and assault guns. In July, 220. In August, 92. By September, the monthly replacement total would drop to just 672 tanks to cover the entire Western Front. Meanwhile, American armored divisions maintained near constant strength despite horrific losses. The 2nd Armored Division entered Operation Cobra with 394 tanks. Throughout the week-long battle, tank strength fluctuated between 385 and 415 vehicles. Losses were replaced almost as quickly as they occurred. This was the American advantage. Not better tanks, better logistics. The Germans could win individual tank battles. They did 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 win individual tank battles. The Go Comces versus the starving war machine. It was never going to be a fair fight. July 29, 1944. The Ronce Pocket. The German defensive line had collapsed. What had started as a breakthrough on July 26 had become a breakout. American armored columns were racing south and west, moving faster than German units could retreat. Communications among German units had broken down almost completely. Supply lines were cut. Units were isolated. What remained of the German army in Normandy was fragmenting into smaller and smaller groups, each trying desperately to escape encirclement. Near the village of Ronce, elements of the 2nd Armored Division caught up with a retreating German column. The scene was chaos. German vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, even civilian vehicles pressed into military service, clogged the narrow Norman roads. They were moving south, trying to reach German lines, but they were moving slowly. Too slowly. The American tanks came from the north and northwest, approaching at speed, infantry riding on their decks. P-47 Thunderbolts flew overhead, ready to strike any German position that offered resistance. The German column tried to fight. A few tanks, Panthers and Panzer IVs, turned to engage. But they were massively outnumbered and had no room to maneuver on the crowded roads. American Shermans fired at point-blank range. Tank destroyers, M36s with powerful 90mm guns, engaged from positions on nearby hills. One by one, the German tanks were destroyed. The column backed up as burning vehicles blocked the road. German soldiers abandoned their vehicles and fled into the fields, trying to escape on foot. Many were cut down by machine gun fire. The Americans pressed forward relentlessly. Tank dozers were brought up to push destroyed vehicles off the roads, so the advance could continue. Recovery vehicles dragged German wrecks into ditches. The column kept moving. What had been a military operation was rapidly becoming a slaughter. Nothing is more devastating than tanks catching infantry in the open. The Sherman's 75mm and 76mm guns fired high explosive rounds that detonated just above the ground, showering fragments over a wide area. The 50 caliber machine guns fired from the tank cupolas their heavy slugs capable of penetrating light vehicles and cutting men in half. German soldiers who tried to surrender were taken prisoner. Those who tried to fight were killed. Those who ran were usually killed. By the evening of July 29th, the remnants of the German column had been annihilated. Hundreds of vehicles destroyed. Thousands of German soldiers killed or captured. The road through Ronce looked like a junkyard. Burned-out tanks, shattered trucks, abandoned artillery pieces and bodies. The Ronce pocket would become one of the iconic images of Operation Cobra's success. Aerial photographs showed the utter devastation, a 6-mile-long corridor of destruction with wrecked vehicles piled 3 deep in places. The German army in Normandy was being destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. Unit after unit was being encircled, shattered, or forced to abandon its equipment and flee on foot. And the American advance continued. The final statistics of Operation Cobra told a story of complete German collapse. For the 2nd Armored Division during July 26–31, American casualties 914, total German casualties inflicted 7,373. An 8-to-1 disparity in casualties. But these numbers, shocking as they were, told only part of the story. Tank losses were more nuanced. American tank losses. The 2nd Armored Division lost 49 M4 tanks during Operation Cobra. Some of these were total losses. Others were damaged and later repaired. By August 3, the division maintained 394 operational tanks, essentially the same number it had started with. German tank losses. The 3 German Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions facing the 2nd Armored Division were effectively destroyed as combat formations. The Panzerlehr Division, which had entered the battle with 41 tanks and assault guns, was reduced to single-digit operational strength. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich lost dozens of vehicles. Exact numbers are hard to determine because German accounting practices were chaotic by late July 1944, but American claims included 29 Panzerkampfubkorps TUI 4 DIS, 138 half-tracks, and armored cars, and hundreds of other vehicles destroyed. But again, raw numbers don't tell the complete story. The critical difference wasn't how many tanks each side lost. It was what happened after they lost those tanks. When the Americans lost 49 Shermans, 49 replacement Shermans arrived within 48 to 72 hours. Damaged tanks that could be repaired were sent to the vehicle collection points, fixed, and returned to service. The 2nd Armored Division's tank strength never dropped below 385 operational vehicles during the entire week of Operation Cobra. When the Germans lost 62 tanks, or however many they actually lost, the exact figure was never properly recorded. They weren't replaced. There were no replacement vehicles sitting in depots waiting to be sent forward. There was no industrial base pumping out hundreds of new tanks every month. German panzer divisions in Normandy simply bled strength until they ceased to function as armored formations. By August 5, 1944, Panzerlehr Division 15 Panzerkampfubkorps was lost. TAA, Uchurjev, Panzer lost or Panzer lost or Panzer lost or Panzer loss, Uchurgens, Points Warrior, Weight of, Points Warrior, Wapreitzwehr Division 15 Panzerkampfubkorps, PAS. They're easier. What Sarah 5 in France. The mathematics of attrition favored overwhelming production. During World War II, the United States produced 49 234 Sherman tanks. Not 49,000 tanks total, 49 234 Shermans alone. Add in light tanks, tank destroyers, and other armored vehicles, and American AFV production exceeded 100,000 vehicles. Approximately 20,000 Shermans were sent to the European theater of operations. Another 4,000 went to the Pacific. The remainder went to Allied nations under Lend-Lease: Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and others. At peak production in 1943, American factories were building more than 2,000 Sherman tanks per month. German tank production for the entire war: BSK PFW 4, 85563 total. Panther approximately 6,000 total. Tiger 1 347 total. Tiger 2 409 total. All other tank types combined several thousand more. Even if you added every single German tank and assault gun produced during the war, the total was less than the number of Sherman tanks alone produced by the United States. And Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. The majority of German armor was committed to the Eastern Front facing the Soviets. The Soviets incidentally had produced approximately 84,000 T-34 tanks during the war, more than 4 times German total tank production. Germany was being buried by the sheer weight of Allied industrial capacity. The reasons for this disparity were numerous. Allied strategic bombing had devastated German industry. Raw material shortages crippled German production, particularly oil rubber and high-quality steel alloys. German factories were dispersed to avoid bombing, which decreased efficiency. Slave labor, which Germany relied on increasingly, was far less productive than free workers. The Nazi government's chaotic bureaucracy led to constant design changes and production disruptions. Meanwhile, the United States had an untouched industrial base protected by 2 oceans. American factories operated 24 hours a day, churning out weapons at rates that would have seemed impossible in 1939. Standardization meant that parts were interchangeable and production could be streamlined. Assembly line techniques perfected by the American automobile industry in the 1920s and 30s were applied to weapons manufacture. The results were staggering. But statistics alone don't capture the human dimension of what happened in Normandy in July 1944. Lieutenant Belton Cooper years later would write about walking through the vehicle collection point after a day of heavy combat. Bodies were still inside some of the knocked-out Shermans. The maintenance crews had to remove them before they could begin repairs. Cooper watched as men, former mechanics and factory workers who'd volunteered to serve their country, carefully extracted the remains of tank crews from destroyed vehicles, trying to keep body parts together so Graves registration could identify the dead. Cooper wrote, "When a tanker inside a tank received the full effect of a penetration, sometimes the body, particularly the head, exploded and scattered blood, gore, and brains throughout the entire compartment. It was a horrible sight." These weren't statistics. They were 19-year-old boys from Ohio and Texas and New York who'd trained for months, climbed into tanks they knew were inferior to what they faced, and died when German shells punched through armor that wasn't thick enough to protect them. Cooper believed, and would argue for the rest of his life, that the Sherman's inferiority was one of the greatest tragedies of World War II. Young Americans bled and died because of bureaucratic failures, inter-service rivalries, and catastrophic miscalculations by weapons designers and military planners. The U.S. Army had developed a superior tank, the M26 Pershing, with heavier armor, wider tracks, and a powerful 90mm gun. The Pershing would have placed American tankers on equal footing with German Panthers. It might even have given them an advantage. But the Pershing was given low priority. Production was limited. The first Pershings didn't arrive in Europe until January 1945, 8 months after D-Day, 3 months before the war ended. Only a few dozen saw combat. Many observers believed that if the Pershing had been available during the November 1944 offensive east of Aachen, American armored forces might have broken through the last vestiges of the Siegfried Line, exited onto the Cologne Plain, and outflanked the German troops building up in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge might never have happened. The war might have ended months earlier. But it didn't. American tank crews fought the entire European campaign in Shermans they knew were inferior. And they won, anyway. Not because the Sherman was a good tank, though it had virtues, but because there were so many of them. Because American industry could replace losses faster than German guns could create them. Because American logistics could keep those tanks fueled, armed, and maintained even hundreds of miles from the nearest port. The Germans had technical superiority. The Americans had overwhelming numbers. In the end, numbers won. Captured German soldiers interviewed after the battle told a consistent story. One tanker from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich captured near Ronce said, "I thought we had already lost the war. When I saw how many tanks you had. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those 5. Then 8 more came. We knocked out those. Another German soldier interviewed in early July after being captured near Saint-Lô was more philosophical. When I saw your columns, the tanks, the trucks, the artillery, everything, I understood that Germany could not win. We might fight for months or years longer. We might kill thousands more of you, but we could not win. Because you have resources we cannot match, imagination we cannot counter, and courage we cannot break. A Panther commander from the Panzer Lehr division captured after his tank was disabled by American artillery expressed grudging respect, mixed with resignation. Your Sherman is not a good tank. Our Panther is much better. Better armor, better gun, better mobility. But it doesn't matter. You have 5 Shermans for every Panther, and when we destroy those 5 you have 5 more. And 5 more after that. We can win individual battles. We cannot win the war. This was the brutal calculus of attrition warfare. German qualitative superiority was real but irrelevant in the face of American quantitative advantage. The German military had built its tactical doctrine around the concept of qualitative superiority. German soldiers were supposed to be better trained, better led, and better equipped than their opponents. German weapons were supposed to be technologically superior. A smaller German force was expected to defeat a larger Allied force through superior skill and equipment. This doctrine had worked in Poland, France, and the early stages of the Russian campaign. It stopped working when Germany faced opponents who could match German quality and exceed German quantity. The Soviet Union had matched German quality with the T-34 tank and exceeded German quantity through massive industrial production. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing more tanks in a month than Germany produced in a year. The United States took a different approach. American planners accepted that the Sherman was qualitatively inferior to German heavy tanks, but they compensated through quantity logistics, combined arms tactics, air superiority, and superior crew training in everything except perhaps the final months, when German experience was exhausted and American replacements were often green. The result was inevitable. Germany couldn't replace its losses. The Allies could. By the end of July 1944, the strategic situation in Normandy had been transformed. The American breakout from Operation Cobra triggered a cascade of Allied successes. The newly arrived 4th and 6th Armored Divisions raced west and south, capturing the vital port of Avranches and bursting into Brittany. British and Canadian forces launched attacks around Caen, pinning German forces in place. The entire German defensive structure in Normandy began to collapse. General Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1, driving deep into the German rear areas. The German response, a desperate counterattack at Mortain, aimed at cutting off the American spearheads, failed completely, and the counterattacking forces were themselves nearly encircled. By mid-August, the German army in Normandy was trapped in the Falaise pocket. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Most of the Wehrmacht's armor in France was destroyed or abandoned. The survivors, those who managed to escape across the Seine River, left behind most of their heavy equipment. The Battle of Normandy was over. The Allies had won a decisive victory. But the lessons of that victory were complex and sometimes misunderstood. The Sherman tank became a symbol, both during the war and after, of American pragmatism over perfectionism. It wasn't the best tank in the world. It was good enough, and good enough backed by overwhelming numbers and superior logistics was sufficient to win. The Sherman had real advantages that often get overlooked in discussions of tank versus tank combat. Reliability. The Sherman rarely broke down. Its engine, whether the Wright Radial, the Ford GAA V8, or the Chrysler Multibank, was reliable and easy to maintain. German tanks, by contrast, were notorious for mechanical failures. Panthers had chronic transmission problems. Tigers were so heavy they damaged roads and bridges and required special railcars for transport. Even the Panzer IV, probably the most reliable German tank, needed more maintenance than a Sherman. Ease of maintenance. The Sherman was designed for ease of repair. The engine could be removed and replaced in hours. Track maintenance was simple. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. German tanks were engineering marvels but nightmares to maintain. A Panther's engine replacement took days and required specialized equipment. Crew survivability. Despite its reputation as a death trap, the Sherman actually had better crew survivability than often acknowledged. The wide hatches meant crews could bail out quickly. The wet stowage ammunition racks significantly reduced the risk of catastrophic fires. British analysis suggested that Sherman crew casualties per tank knocked out were actually somewhat lower than German tank crew casualties. Versatility. The Sherman was adequate for most missions. And here is the critical point: most tank combat didn't involve tank versus tank engagements. American analysis showed that 71% of Sherman ammunition expenditure in Europe was high explosive rounds used against infantry fortifications and soft targets. Only 19% was armor-piercing ammunition used against enemy tanks. The Sherman's 75mm gun was actually excellent for infantry support, precisely what tanks did most of the time. The Sherman's weakness in tank versus tank combat was real and significant. But tank versus tank combat wasn't the primary role of armored divisions. Their primary role was exploitation, breaking through enemy lines, disrupting rear areas, encircling enemy forces, and maintaining relentless forward momentum. For this mission, the Sherman was more than adequate. The Americans also compensated for the Sherman's deficiencies through superior combined arms doctrine. German tanks in Normandy often fought in isolation or with minimal support. Panzer divisions were supposed to operate as combined arms formations, but by 1944, most German panzer divisions were under strength in everything except tanks. Infantry support was limited. Artillery was insufficient. Air support was non-existent. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies. American armored divisions, by contrast, never allowed tanks to fight alone. Every Sherman advance was coordinated with infantry. Armored infantry in half-tracks accompanied every tank attack. They could dismount to clear enemy positions, protect tanks from close-range anti-tank weapons, and occupy ground captured by the tanks. Artillery. American artillery was abundant, mobile, and devastating. The 105mm howitzers could fire 4 rounds per minute. Forward observers traveling with the tanks could call in fire missions within minutes. Time on target missions. where multiple batteries fired simultaneously to have all shells arrive at the same instant, could obliterate German positions. Tank destroyers. The M10, M18, and M36 tank destroyers provided mobile anti-armor capability. When Shermans encountered Panthers or Tigers they couldn't handle, tank destroyers with more powerful guns would be called forward. Air support. American air superiority was total. P-47 Thunderbolts provided armored column cover, flying overhead and striking any German position that threatened the advance. Forward air controllers traveling with tank columns could call in airstrikes within minutes. Combat engineers. Armored engineer battalions accompanied the divisions capable of clearing mines, building bridges, destroying obstacles, and performing countless other tasks necessary to maintain momentum. This combined arms approach meant that German tanks seldom faced Sherman tanks in isolation. A Panther that ambushed a column of Shermans might knock out several before American artillery obliterated its position. A Tiger that blocked a road would be bypassed while P-47s bombed it. A German strongpoint might stop one American column only to be surrounded when other columns maneuvered around it. The Germans had better tanks. The Americans had a better system. American tankers also developed numerous tactical innovations to compensate for their vehicles' deficiencies. The Kulin hedgerow cutter allowed Shermans to punch through Norman hedgerows instead of climbing over them, dramatically improving mobility and reducing vulnerability. White phosphorus tactics enabled Shermans to neutralize German heavy tanks they couldn't destroy through conventional means. Field armor modifications were common. Units welded additional armor plates to vulnerable areas: the front glacis, the sides, the ammunition storage areas. Some units created elaborate armor packages using salvaged steel. Others used sandbags, though this was discouraged. Aggressive close-range tactics. American tank commanders quickly learned that at ranges under 500 meters even inferior Shermans could penetrate German armor, especially if they could hit weak points like the side armor, rear armor, or turret ring. Aggressive maneuvering to close range became standard practice. Better fire control. The Sherman's gyrostabilizer, a system that kept the gun roughly on target even while the tank was moving, gave American tanks an advantage in meeting engagements. A Sherman could fire accurately while moving. German tanks had to stop to shoot accurately. Superior optics and vision. The Sherman's periscopic gun sight offered better situational awareness than the German telescopic sight. The commander's position, though less ideal than the German commander's cupola, was adequate, and many American commanders fought with hatches open for maximum visibility. Communication. American tanks had superior radios. Every tank had an FM radio which was more resistant to interference than the German AM sets. Every tank also had an intercom system for crew communication. German tanks often lacked intercoms. Crew members communicated by shouting or using hand signals. These tactical and technical advantages didn't make the Sherman equal to a Panther or Tiger in a head-to-head duel, but they narrowed the gap significantly. And when combined with numerical superiority, they tipped the balance firmly in America's favor. The human element was perhaps most important of all. American tank crews knew they were in inferior vehicles. They knew German tanks could kill them at ranges where they couldn't fight back. They knew that climbing into a Sherman meant accepting a significant risk of death or horrible injury. And they did it anyway. Some did it out of patriotism, belief in the cause, determination to defeat fascism, desire to protect American values and freedom. Some did it out of duty. They'd been drafted or had enlisted and they would do their jobs regardless of the danger. Some did it out of camaraderie, loyalty to their crew, their platoon, their unit. They wouldn't let their friends down. But all of them did it with courage. Real courage. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear. Lieutenant George Wilson, the young infantry officer, would lain in the gutter in St. Gilles, watching Sherman's duel with Panzers at point-blank range, survived the war. In his memoirs, he wrote about the tank crews Head fought alongside. They knew the odds. Every tanker knew the Sherman was outgunned and under-armored. They knew that if they encountered a Panther or Tiger, they would probably die. But they climbed into those tanks every morning and rolled forward. I never heard one of them complain about their equipment. They just did their jobs. That kind of courage, quiet, professional, uncomplaining courage, is what won the war. Lieutenant Colonel Lindsay Harkness, who'd switched tanks after his command vehicle was knocked out and continued to lead his battalion forward, exemplified this attitude. When offered evacuation after being wounded in a pistol duel with German officers, he refused. The mission came first. Always. Sergeant Hulan Whittington, who'd spotted the German column approaching in darkness and held his position under fire to direct American counterfire, received the Medal of Honor. But he insisted Head only done what any soldier would do. His job was to observe and report. So he observed and reported. The fact that he did so while German shells were exploding around him was, in his view, just part of the job. These men, and thousands like them, compensated for inadequate equipment through superior courage, training, and determination. The Germans had better tanks, but the Americans had better soldiers. Or rather, both sides had brave, skilled, dedicated soldiers. But the Americans had a system that supported those soldiers better, replaced losses faster, and maintained offensive momentum longer. July 31, 1944, somewhere south of Coutances, Oberleutnant Friedrich Lex of 5. Kompanie Panzer Lehr Regiment 130, sat in a ditch beside a dirt road. His Panzer IV was 3 kilometers behind him, burning. The transmission had seized, a catastrophic mechanical failure, and before his crew could even attempt repairs, American fighter bombers had appeared overhead and rocketed the immobilized tank. Lex had escaped with his crew. They'd run through fields, dodging American patrols trying to reach German lines. Except, there were no more German lines. Not really. The entire front had collapsed. The Panzer Lehr Division, once an elite formation, the training division for the entire Panzer force, had been destroyed as a combat-effective unit. Most of its tanks were gone. Most of its infantry were dead, wounded, or captured. The survivors were scattered across the Norman countryside trying to escape encirclement. Lex thought back to that morning 6 days ago. It felt like a lifetime. When Head watched the American Shermans approaching St. Gilles, Head been so confident, so certain of German superiority. His 7.5-centimeter gun against their 75 millimeters. His 4 inches of armor against their 2.5. His training and experience against their, what? Enthusiasm? Industrial capacity? Sheer audacity? Head mocked them. Ronson lighters. Death traps. Inferior machines crewed by mediocre soldiers. And they'd crushed him anyway. Not through superior tactics. Not through better equipment. But through sheer overwhelming numbers. For every German tank there were 5 American tanks. For every German shell there were 20 American shells. For every German soldier there were 5 American soldiers. For every German fighter plane, actually there were no German fighter planes. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies. Lex heard engines approaching. American engines. He could identify them by sound now, the distinctive rumble of Sherman power plants, different from the German Maybach engines Head grown up with. He looked up. Down the road came an American column. Sherman's half-tracks trucks. Dozens of vehicles. Maybe 100 vehicles. An endless stream of American armor rolling south, advancing deeper into France. One of the Sherman commanders stood in his cupola scanning the terrain. He saw Lex and his crew sitting in the ditch. For a moment their eyes met across 100 meters of Norman farmland. The American didn't even bother to stop. He just pointed at them, said something into his radio, and kept moving. A half-track from later in the column would collect them as prisoners. The Sherman rolled past onto the next objective, and the one after that. Behind it came more Shermans. And more. And more. Lex watched them go. He thought about the question that German soldier had asked in the interrogation. How can we fight a nation that can do this? The answer was simple, though he was only now beginning to fully understand it. You can't. You can have better tanks. You can have better guns. You can have better training, better doctrine, better tactical skill. But you can't fight an enemy that can replace losses faster than you can inflict them. You can't fight an enemy whose industrial base produces more tanks in a week than you produce in a month. You can't fight an enemy who fields 5 soldiers for every one of yours and has 5 more waiting in reserve. Germany had built technological marvels. The Panther, the Tiger, the King Tiger. Engines of war that represented the pinnacle of mechanical engineering and metallurgical science. And it didn't matter. Because the Americans had built something more important than perfect tanks. They'd built a system. A logistics system that could deliver thousands of adequate tanks to the front and keep them supplied, fueled, armed, and maintained. A training system that produced competent crews faster than combat could eliminate them. An industrial system that churned out weapons at rates Germany could never hope to match. The mockery had turned to ashes. German tankers had laughed at the Sherman, called it inferior, claimed massive kill ratios, 5 Shermans destroyed for every Panzer lost 10 to 1, even higher. And all those statistics were meaningless, because for every Sherman destroyed, another Sherman appeared. For every American crew killed, another crew arrived. By war's end, Germany would have almost no tanks left. The factories would be bombed into rubble. The supply lines would be severed. The remaining Panzer divisions would be shadows of their former strength, often fielding single-digit numbers of operational tanks. America would have thousands of Shermans in reserve, thousands more in production. Enough to supply not just American divisions but British divisions, Free French divisions, even Soviet units under Lend-Lease. The Sherman would serve in Korea, in the Middle East, in conflicts around the world for decades after World War II ended. Not because it was the best tank ever built, but because it was good enough and there were so many of them. The verdict of history is clear: the Sherman won. Not because it was superior to German tanks in individual combat. It wasn't. The statistics are undeniable. A Panther or Tiger could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't effectively fight back. But war isn't decided by individual duels. War is decided by logistics, industrial capacity, strategic vision, and the ability to sustain operations over months and years. The Sherman represented American pragmatism at its finest. Good enough is good enough when you have enough of them. Perfect is the enemy of good. Quantity has a quality all its own. These phrases sound like cliches, but they're rooted in brutal truth. Germany spent precious resources building a few hundred King Tigers, engineering masterpieces that were too heavy, too complex, too expensive, and too difficult to maintain. America built 50,000 Shermans, adequate machines that were reliable, maintainable, and available in overwhelming numbers. Germany won tactical victories. America won the war. The Sherman's critics, then and now, point to its weaknesses: inadequate armor, insufficient gun, vulnerability to fire. All true. Lieutenant Belton Cooper was right to call it a tragedy that American tankers had to fight in inferior equipment. Better tanks could have saved lives. But the Sherman's defenders point to its strengths: reliability, ease of maintenance, versatility, adequate performance for most missions, and above all, availability in crushing numbers. Without the Sherman, without 50,000 Shermans, the war would have lasted longer and cost more lives. Both perspectives are valid. The Sherman was simultaneously a flawed design and a war-winning weapon. It was inferior to German heavy tanks and superior to German logistics. It was inadequate for tank versus tank combat, and more than adequate for the operational and strategic missions that actually won the war. The final image is fitting: endless columns of Shermans rolling across Europe in the late summer and fall of 1944. Through France, into Belgium, through the Siegfried Line, or a war children across the battlefields of Europe. Numbers matters matinées. Across Siegfried, numbers knocked. In Gau, numbers. Thisters care too. With Germain Jimixade some matinée says. Knock. 2. 2. 2. Numbers. 2. 2. Knock. 2. Knock. Dull. Knock. 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 Dull. Knock. Bell. Knock. 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 Bell. Knock. 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 Now. Wah. Knock. 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 2. Knock. 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 You can have the best tank in the world. But if you can only build a few hundred of them, and your enemy can build 50,000 adequate tanks, you're going to lose. The German gunners learned that lesson in the summer of 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, on the roads of France, in the forests of the Ardennes, and finally in the ruins of Germany itself. They learned it the hard way. And the Sherman, mocked, maligned, dismissed as inferior, rolled on to victory. Operation Cobra, July 25–31, 1944, resulted in the destruction of German forces in Normandy and opened the path for the Allied liberation of France. The M4 Sherman tank, despite its tactical deficiencies, served as the backbone of American armored forces throughout the European campaign. More than 49,000 Shermans were produced during World War II, and the tank saw service in conflicts around the world for decades after the war's end. The lesson of Normandy, that overwhelming industrial capacity and logistical superiority, and can superiority at superiority, and com des, and Yermans all way. Machenzor, and Jur, ran, ter world. With messenger, disting on tuar. Messixi mixer outis. The othos is a visser to meet your messen, and you're all way. Machenzall, messengera. Messengera, has you're all. Machenzar, disse. Machenzall. Impixer, natsuria, you're all. Machenzall, Machenzall. Nepictis, Messixemes, y. Machenzar, messengera. Machenzall.